For most of human history, food had to survive the seasons, not the hours between grocery deliveries, not the days between refrigeration cycles, but entire winters, entire droughts, entire journeys across deserts and oceans. And somehow, long before electricity or steel appliances, people built preservation systems that could keep food edible for months, sometimes even years. These weren't crude improvisations, they were refined methods, tested quietly across generations. And a few of these techniques are so resilient that even modern deep freezers cannot fully replace them, especially if the power grid stops working. Today, we're looking at 3 of those ancient systems, methods designed for a world without electricity, without industrial refrigeration, without global supply chains. Each one solves a different weakness in modern food storage, and together they reveal something interesting about resilience, because sometimes the most durable technology is also the oldest. Third and most common method in our list is fermentation, or preservation through transformation. At first glance, fermentation can look accidental. Vegetables sitting in salt water, milk slowly turning into yogurt, grains bubbling quietly inside clay jars. But fermentation is not decay, it's controlled transformation. Certain bacteria convert natural sugars into acids. That acid lowers the pH of the food, and suddenly the environment becomes hostile to harmful microbes. In simple terms, fermentation changes the ecosystem inside the food itself. Many civilizations discovered this process independently. Korea developed kimchi, Europe produced sauerkraut, West Africa fermented cassava, Central Asia cultured milk into kefir. Each culture built its own microbial system, but the underlying idea remained the same: salt, limited oxygen, and time. And here's something interesting. Fermented foods often last longer than fresh foods stored in a refrigerator. Properly fermented vegetables can remain stable for months. Some aged foods like miso or traditional cheeses can last for years. Even more fascinating, fermentation sometimes improves nutrition. According to research cited by the Food and Agriculture Organization, fermentation can increase vitamin availability. It can also improve digestibility. So preservation and nutrition improve at the same time. But fermentation also solves another survival problem. It decentralizes food stability. You don't need factories, you don't need electricity, just containers, salt, and patience. But fermentation works by transforming food. The next method works differently. Instead of changing the chemistry, it removes something microbes depend on: water. The second method in our list is dehydration, or removing the microbial fuel. Most microorganisms require moisture. Without water, bacteria and mold struggle to grow. Ancient societies realized this thousands of years ago, so they began removing water from food, using sun, wind, and gentle heat. It sounds simple, but dehydration is one of the most powerful preservation techniques humans ever discovered. Take dried fish. In Northern Europe, stockfish, air-dried cod, has been produced for more than 1,000 years. The fish hang on wooden racks in cold coastal winds. Over several weeks, nearly all moisture evaporates. What remains is dense protein, food that can last for years when stored correctly. And this system appears across the world. Central Asian cultures dried yogurt into travel rations. South American civilizations produced charqui, thin strips of dried meat. Middle Eastern regions developed sun-dried fruits. Each method relied on natural energy: sunlight, airflow, wind. No infrastructure required. And the stability of dehydrated foods can be remarkable. Properly dried grains or legumes can remain edible for decades. Even NASA uses dehydration technology for space missions. Removing water dramatically increases shelf life while reducing weight. But dehydration reveals something important. Modern freezers protect food by lowering temperature, but they rely entirely on electricity. If the grid stops working, frozen food immediately begins warming. Dehydrated food doesn't have that weakness. Once moisture is gone, microbial activity slows dramatically. Even long power outages won't suddenly spoil it. Of course, dehydration changes texture. Some foods become tough, some become brittle, which is why ancient cultures developed another preservation system, one that combines dehydration with chemical protection, and that leads to the next method. Today's last and the most effective method in our list is curing and salting, or the mineral barrier. Salt was once so valuable it functioned almost like currency. Entire trade routes existed just to transport it. The reason was simple: salt preserves food extremely well. When salt contacts food, it draws moisture out through osmosis. That dehydration slows microbial growth. At the same time, high salt concentrations disrupt many bacteria directly. So curing creates two protective barriers at once: less moisture and chemical protection. This method appears again and again throughout history. Salted cod sustained long ocean voyages. Salted pork fed armies during long campaigns. Salted olives and fish traveled across vast trade networks. Some curing techniques go even further. Prosciutto, for example, is salted and air-dried for over a year. Traditional European hams sometimes age even longer. During that time, enzymes slowly transform the meat. Flavor deepens, texture changes, but the preservation barrier remains. According to the Food and Agricultural Organization, salting and curing were among the earliest large-scale food preservation systems, and they required almost no machinery, just salt, airflow, and patience. But curing also solved another survival challenge: mobility. Salted foods became portable calorie reserves, travel rations, emergency food supplies, trade goods that could move across continents. Still, ancient societies rarely relied on just one method. They layered them. Fish might be salted and then dried, vegetables fermented and stored in cool cellars, meat cured and later smoked. Each layer added another barrier against spoilage. Modern food scientists call this multi-barrier preservation, but ancient communities practiced it naturally, without scientific terminology, just observation, just experience. And that's something we're thinking about, because modern preservation is powerful, but it's also centralized. Electric grids, industrial refrigeration, cold chain logistics. Ancient systems were different. They were local, distributed, independent. And that's why many of them still work today, even in a world without power. Resilient systems rarely look dramatic. They grow quietly. Salt drawing water from food, wind slowly drying fish on wooden racks, bacteria transforming vegetables in a jar. Small reactions, slow processes. But those simple mechanisms once allowed entire civilizations to store harvests. Where fallout raccoon and skecho calypsi fails, our chimp survive winters and cross oceans, season after season, generation after generation. And sometimes, the most durable technologies are the ones humanity discovered long before modern machines existed.